Well, hello. And the old question, where is Simon today? You probably saw last word for the week, I was outside and halfway through my little recording, it started to snow. Well, we've lived through that. Various named storms and whatnot have been going on. And outside today, it is pretty nasty and horrible. Sleet and the remains of snow. It's cold and it's nasty. So Simon today is inside by his fire. Welcome to the word for the week. James 5, 7-12 is a single pastoral exhortation to patient endurance under social and economic pressure, grounded in the hope of Christ's coming. Models from rural life, farming life, prophetic endurance, and Job are invoked to stimulate behavior and speech while waiting for the Lord to come and put things right. And James's original audience faced severe economic hardship, social dislocation. Many were tenant farmers, landless labourers, or rural tradespeople caught in an oppressive agrarian economy dominated by wealthy elites who exploited them. They'd been defrauded of wages, suffered legal manipulation, and even endured the violent deaths of good people. And the immediate pastoral problem, James writes to a community under economic and social pressure then, burdened by injustice. The broader context records complaints about the rich, exploitation, loss of wages and lawsuits, and the concrete instruction to be patient and the pictorial use of farming imagery and so on suggest an audience familiar with the cycles of life in farming and with immediate material anxieties arising from it. And into that pressure cooker of frustration, impatience, resentment, and spiritual fatigue, James speaks a profoundly pastoral, profoundly realistic message. Wait, endure, guard your community, guard your tongue. Above all, trust the character of the coming Lord. The passage's structure flows naturally. He exhorts these people to patience while waiting for the Lord, chapter 5, verses 7-8. Then there's an ethical injunction against grumbling and premature judgment, chapter 5, verse 9. Social restraint amongst brothers, reflecting internal complaint. And then there's authoritative exemplars cited, exemplars of endurance, chapter 5, verses 10-11. The prophets and Job, models with the theological interpretation of the model that they hold out to us. And there's a conclusion, interestingly, about speech and oaths. Keep your word, chapter 5, verse 12. Final ethical rule there about truthful speech, flowing from the waiting theme and the way that waiting is portrayed to us. See, the thing is this, the Christian life in general is lived in the tension between present injustice and promised intervention. We don't yet live in the world as it ought to be, nor do we live in the world as it finally shall be. And James's congregation, if you like, his hearers, his readers, knew that tension intensely. Each section answers the practical question, how do we live now while we wait? And the answer encompasses attitude, behavior, inspiration, and speech ethics. Put simply, James is saying wait patiently, don't grumble or swear, because the Lord is coming. Imitate the patient. So, firstly, chapter 5, verses 7-8, patience rooted in the certainty that Jesus is coming back. Starts off with a command, be patient. James has got this aorist imperative there, be patient, calling to an ongoing, habitual stance, posture, attitude in life. Choice of the particular Greek word describes restraint toward persons, toward people. enduring difficult people. Now, there's a different term used later to describe Job. That's about enduring circumstances, but this is very much about people until the presence of the Lord, until he comes. It implies continuous action, a sustained practice of waiting and self-control. It's a lifestyle choice to be made, says James. Ongoing lifestyle choice. But it's based on consciousness of, meditation on, and having your thinking formed by something other than you. Christ's coming. But it definitely results in you acting and behaving in a particular ongoing way in the here and now. And the question is of crucial pastoral and theological significance. How is that waiting motivated? First motivation that James comes up with, the second point on these couple of verses, is God's patience. See, in the Old Testament, this verb that's being used here often describes God's own patient restraint in stepping in to rescue, to redeem, to rectify situations and people inside his space-time creation. Exodus 34, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, uses this verb. And that passage is revealing about what's involved here, because it reveals God's patience as the model for what James is telling us and his hearers to live out. Okay, Exodus 34. Picture that situation. Something like this. Moses had one job: to bring down God's commandments on stone tablets from the mountain. But he gets within sight of camp and he sees everyone partying with a golden calf like it's some ancient rave. And Moses absolutely loses it. They're off committing idolatry. He hasn't come down the mountain yet. They've broken God's covenant before Moses can even get it down the mountain to them. And distraught, Moses smashes the tablets that bear the broken covenant. But see, in Exodus 34, that isn't the end of the story, because God comes straight back to Moses in that chapter. All right, Moses, we need to have another chat. Grab your chisel. Moses is probably thinking he's going to get a bit of a stiff talking to. He's getting called to the principal's office kind of thing. Well, so he is. But astonishingly, the patient God just tells him to carve out 2 new stone tablets. Moses has to provide the rock this time, but there's a twist to the tale. Well, anyway, Moses gets up super early. He hauls himself up this mountain carrying 2 heavy stone slabs that he's cut out, and he waits. And then in his time, God shows up in a cloud. But here's the really wild part. Instead of lecturing Moses about the whole tablet smashing incident, God introduces himself. God introduces himself. No, not like, hello, I'm Steve. No, nothing like that. More like God drops the most epic character self-description ever. He says, I'm the Lord. And he uses the covenant name of God. I'm the Lord, compassionate, gracious, patient, absolutely loaded with love and faithfulness, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. God is basically saying, before we get into the rules again, let me remind you who it is who's talking to you, who I am. I'm not just some angry deity wanting to zap people. I'm slow to anger. I've got mercy for days. And it's who I am that I love to forgive the really bad stuff. So the whole scene there up that mountain in Exodus 34 is God hitting the reset button with Moses, but making sure Moses understands the heart behind all of that first. It's not just about rules on stone, says God. It's about relationship with a God who's both incredibly loving and incredibly serious about making things right again. So the question arises then, as James uses that word and evokes all that Old Testament history, what is God the model of for us here? He's the model for this thing James is talking about. Patience with people. It's not passive resignation James is calling for. It's active self-governance rooted in embracing God's own values and in confidence about God's ability and desire to take care of things that trouble us when we do this and imitate him in this way. See, James isn't advocating coping strategies, self-help, or emotional management. He takes us way outside ourselves and he begins with the doctrine of the end times, eschatology. He says, be patient, therefore, brothers, in this way that he's cited by referring to all that use of that word in the Old Testament. Be patient, therefore, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. This is crucial. Christian patience is not psychological stoicism. It arises out of the Christians living in theologically powered expectation of the coming again of Christ the King in heavenly glory. I'm talking about something you know, says James. It's outside of you, but it's spectacularly inside your box if you're a Christian. Christ coming back. As a Christian, you should be living, he's saying, with this expectation. Living in it, on it, and because of it. See, what James is asking for is based on things right at the forefront of the Christian's consciousness. Jesus is coming back as Christ the King, and he is the one who intervenes to sort the pain and chaos out. Why be patient with people? There's the divine analogy. But James is about to root this heavenly example in the everyday world of his hearers. And he moves on at the second part of verse 7 to the analogy of the farmer. James says, behold, he says, look, an attention marker. Often used in prophetic discourse. He's steeped in the Old Testament, is James. Behold, introducing an analogy that makes patience visible. See the farmer, he says. The farmer waits expectantly for the precious fruit of the earth. The farmer becomes James's first embodied illustration of patient waiting. Now, on a day-to-day basis, most farmers I know are not like that, but it's the overall principle. The verb implies expectant waiting, not merely passing the time, mind. He waits for precious, valuable fruit, a term used for honor, value, or even costliness. He waits, being patient over it until he receives the early and the late rains that are going to make it all happen for him, you see. Now, Israel's agricultural cycle is a bit of a biblical motif of divine timing. The farmer isn't just sitting back waiting, he's not apathetic, he's not being idle, he works, he prepares, and then crucially, he waits on timing he cannot control. James emphasizes this by naming the early and late rains. You can't control where they come. You've done all you can, but then you've got to wait because there are things you can do and there are things you can't. And all this is not just meteorological trivia. They're covenant markers displaying God's faithfulness to his covenant people as their covenant king Israel knew. God controls the timing that brings the fruit. And then James turns to the congregation. In that sort of way, in like manner, also be patient, he says. Just as the farmer stabilizes his life around divine timing, so must the church. Old Testament allusions then reinforce that human labor depends on God's providential schedule. The farmer can't manipulate the early and late rains and when it'll come, but he waits because he knows that as surely as God is faithful, the rain will come. He has promised and he will do it. The effect of the disempowered experience that James's original exiled hearers were having would be to create a life lived in what felt like perilous uncertainty. But this reference to God being able to be relied upon in the agricultural context and the agricultural cycle, when humans feel perilously at the mercy of the seasons and the elements, reminds us to do what James is saying, because God is reliable and will not leave us hanging. See, James's word choices highlight that precious fruit signals value inevitably due to God's faithfulness, not the uncertainty humans feel in situations like that of James's hearers. So James says here, practice patience. And he says it twice. Because verse 8, there's a double imperative. James is strengthening that call to be patient. He's saying be patient, and secondly, establish your hearts. Saying the same thing two ways, really. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. And that second imperative, establish your hearts or stand firm, it implies intentional, internal firmness then. Strengthen your hearts. You may not control your circumstances, but by God's Spirit, you can stabilize the inner core of your being. And there's a really important thing we need to recognize and get hold of here. What James is calling for is not going to come naturally to us. We've got to do something about this. There's conscious activity to be undertaken here, says James, to adopt the regular spiritual habit of actively strengthening our hearts. Now, the important thing to notice in connection with that is that we're not being called upon to exercise machismo. This isn't muscular Christianity, far less some of the so-called Christian nationalism we've been witnessing on the world stage, as well as in the UK in recent times. Now, James roots this strong heart cultivation on the basis of the Lord's coming back. Better look at that motivation in a bit more detail. We referred to it a couple of times. What's happening? Why strengthen your hearts? Because the coming of the Lord has drawn near, says James in verse 8. Now, the perfect tense signals a completed action with ongoing effects. His coming is not merely future, it is imminent in its certainty. That perfect tense means the nearness of his coming is already established. We live in the era of its impending reality. And notice this: God's justice is not delayed. It is poised at the door. This is the spiritual foundation of the entire passage. A steadfast heart rests in the certainty of God's timing and return to redeem and restore his kingdom and its citizens with it. Our inner world stabilizes when God's future becomes more real to us than our present frustrations. Now, none of this is to minimize or deny that our present is complicated by frustration. James acknowledges that in his understanding of the things that his hearers are facing. And it's a particular outcome of bearing pressure like that which James addresses next in verse 9. Because when you're under pressure, have you noticed? You get ratty. I've dealt with that a little bit in one of the super short thoughts this week leading up to this. Do not grumble, says James. In verses 7 to 8, they look outward towards God's future, where verse 9 looks inward towards human relationships under pressure. And as he addresses a real problem the pressurized believers face, James issues a prohibition, a warning, an intensification of warning. Firstly, the prohibition, do not grumble. The verb means to sigh, groan, or grumble with resentment. It's used in Romans 8 of creation's groaning. But here, James warns against, internalized resentment being expressed towards fellow believers, even at a low level. They've had economic pressure. They've got exploitation, prolonged waiting. And these things often produce horizontal frustration, with one another. James sees the danger. Bitterness among the oppressed often turns inward on one another, fracturing the very community meant to sustain them. And secondly, with that warning, with that prohibition, don't grumble, comes a further warning. Don't do it lest you be judged. See, in a remarkable rhetorical move, James says, don't judge, don't grumble, lest you be judged. Behold, the judge stands at the door. Notice the irony there. The oppressed who cry out for justice risk becoming unjust through internal community grumbling. And James forces his readers to realize that victimization does not confer moral license. You can't get away with stuff because you're suffering a bit. And then he says, perfect tense, the judge is already at the door, already standing in position and going on doing so. At the doors. Classic apocalyptic imagery, implying urgency, readiness, and the proximity of the Lord's return. There's a pastoral point here. Waiting and frustrated people often turn irritably against one another, and James calls the congregation to a community posture shaped not by shared suffering, but by shared accountability to the coming judge and good relationships with one another amongst those who are suffering in this way. The wrong response to oppression is horizontal grumbling. The right response is the vertical confidence in the God, the Lord, who is the judge, who is close by at the door. He's the judge, not the angered or impatient believer. Well, that's the theology, and James realizes they need examples, exemplars, people to look up to motivate and help them to do this. So in chapter 5, verses 10 to 11, he gives exemplars of endurance. And he gives two categories, the prophets and Job. And he uses two different words for one and the other. Now he's strengthening this exhortation with this example, and he starts with the prophets as models, verse 10. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord for your example. There's a word there that means the written pattern, the illustrative model. Who's the pattern? Old Testament prophets. They're described as those who spoke in the name of the Lord. And it's their faithfulness to the Lord that gets them into this frustrating situation. And he's evoking Elijah confronting Ahab and Jezebel on Mount Carmel. He's evoking Micah confronting the leaders, people, and false prophets of Israel very boldly, very bravely. He's citing Jeremiah confronting that terrible fake priest in Judah who persecuted him from beating him and having him put in the stocks. And Amos, when Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, tried to silence him, and Amos called down God's judgment and told it like it was. Think of the prophets and their patient perseverance, says James, holding the line, continuing to speak for God, all of whom suffered for speaking truth against socio-economic injustice, directly paralleling James's theme with this audience. Prophets embody vocational faithfulness despite suffering. And here's the big thing the readers must recognize. Enduring injustice is not abnormal for those who stand out and speak up for God. It's not unusual. It is their characteristic. And then he's going to come and use a different word for what's being asked for. Job gives this tremendous example as well, he says in verse 11. James moves from many prophets to one man, to Job, giving a deeply theological reading of the book. You've heard of the endurance of Job. Using a different term. One term emphasizes restraint towards one another. This term here about Job, it emphasizes resilient steadfastness under trial. But James doesn't stop at personal provocation. He goes on to Job's endurance, you see. He uses this phrase then, the outcome of the Lord. You've seen the outcome of the Lord from Job's endurance. The Lord's intended outcome, the divinely purposed end result visible in Job 42 of that endurance of Job's. The emphasis isn't Job's heroic virtue, but God's compassionate intervention at the end of the day. And then in verse 11, James grounds that all. He says, the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Do this because God is very compassionate and merciful. Just like Exodus 34. Abundantly tender-hearted, full of mercy is what James is saying God is like. And that's deeply rooted back, as we said, in that self-revelation of God in Exodus 34, 6 and 7. And it's repeated throughout the prophets. That's what God is like. So James is saying patience and endurance are fueled by a true vision of God's character. If God is compassionate and merciful, then the long arc of suffering bends inevitably toward divine restoration. And James says Jesus is coming back. Finally, in verse 12, James gives us this prohibition: do not swear. And that's not profanity, it's oath-taking as an emotional shortcut to credibility. When people feel powerless, unheard, or impatient, they often resort to exaggerated speech. Honestly, truly, I swear. Again, there's a super short thought on that that's been published already from the week leading up to this. Oaths in antiquity were often attempts to force persuasion when trust was strained. Prefer, says James, the simplicity of personal integrity. Let your yes be yes. And that echoes Jesus directly, of course. The phrase functions as a call to transparent integrity, which is the opposite of impatient, manipulative speech. And why should we do that, says James? Well, very straightforward again. He says, do this so that you may not fall under judgment. He returns to the theme of divine personal evaluation. A community waiting for God's judgment must itself practice speech that does not manipulate, distort, or pressure. We're waiting for God to sort things out. And impatient suffering tempts us to grasp for control over circumstances, over people, over conversations. James says, you do not need to swear to manipulate. You do not need verbal shortcuts to credibility. The Lord's coming. Therefore speak simply, truthfully, patiently. Now before we leave this, let's just remember the real world life situation behind all these things that James is saying. James's readers belong to a fragile, economically stressed, socially marginalized rural minority in the earliest Jewish Christian communities. Their world featured exploitative agricultural elites who seized land and controlled legal outcomes. They lived with unstable income patterns, heavily dependent on rainfall and harvest cycles. Long-term wage theft, documented historically in Roman-era rural economies, really affected them. They were living with legal vulnerability since the wealthy controlled the courts, and internal tensions amongst themselves arising from hardship, scarcity, and resentment. So this call to patience countered their temptation toward despair. The warning against grumbling countered their temptation towards internal fracturing of their community. And the examples of prophets and Job countered their sense of abnormality or abandonment when things were not going very well for them. The command about speech and oaths countered their temptation toward manipulative self-defense and trying to make things go their way. See, James is not telling well-off people to chill and wait. He's telling exhausted, exploited, rural believers how to hold fast without imploding until the just judge arrives to deliver them. Okay, well, let's come to a conclusion. The unifying thread through all of this. All of James 5:7-12 is about how God's people need to be faithful and to live faithfully between the jaws of exploitation and the relief of eschatological justice when Christ the King comes back. The unifying thread is faithful, patient integrity while waiting for the Lord's certain intervention. And it shows up as patience in untoward circumstances, restraint shown toward one another when we're feeling stressed with other people, an endurance that looks to God's faithfulness and compassion in coming back, and truthful, non-manipulative speech. But let's please be very clear about what this passage is not. It is not a moral exhortation to find within yourself the wherewithal to be patient in frustration when injustice and suffering are perpetrated against you. You are not fundamentally being exhorted to try harder to be a patient person. You are fundamentally asked to think outside yourself rather than allow your brain to be boxed in by your immediate experience. You're not being asked to think outlandish things outside the box. Because the source, drive, fuel for all of this, the basic ability to do it, for living patiently under injustice, suffering and so on, is very much inside your box but outside yourself. Farming? Thoughts from inside your box as a believer. Prophets? Very much inside your box. The return of your Saviour, the Lord Jesus Christ, in His heavenly glory with the holy angels, which is very much your hope in life and in death. Totally inside your box, your consciousness, your view of life and destiny as a believer. Totally inside it, unless, of course, you let go on being a believer. In your daily life, in your daily thinking and working. Let go in your daily life of the one who so graciously and lovingly laid hold of you. In a world where injustice breeds impatience, and impatience, it ends up breeding sin. In a world like that, James calls the church to become a community hugely conscious day to day, and therefore to be massively shaped and formed not by its woes and discomforts, but by this one thing, the return of Christ the King in heavenly glory. And that is not for the believer, pie in the sky when you die, but that for which we long and yearn as those persuaded of the promise and the faithfulness of God. God. Our God. And that expectation remodels it all. Oh, may God bless you in the abundant enjoyment of that expectation as you put your trust in Him this week and seek to live with the frustrations and the pains and the challenges that life holds out to so many of us until He comes. He's poised, not delayed, already at the door.